There are some promises you make that change the course of your life. For Sheila Wysocki, that promise was to her college roommate, a vibrant, smart young woman named Angela Samota. In 1984, Angela was murdered in her Dallas apartment. The case went cold for decades, but Sheila refused to let her friend be forgotten, and in the end, her persistence would bring a killer to justice. This is the story of Angela Samota and the friend who wouldn't give up. Angela Marie Samota was born on September 19, 1964, in Alameda, California. She was the youngest of 5 children, arriving into a family that adored her. Her father, Frank Samota, unfortunately died when she was still an infant, leaving her mother, Betty Ruth, to raise the family. Not long after, the Samotas relocated to Amarillo, Texas, where Angela grew up in a comfortable, loving home. From the start, Angela radiated a kind of energy that made her unforgettable. Friends and family would later describe her as the girl whose smile could light up a room. She was quick to laugh, endlessly curious, and had a knack for making people feel seen. She wasn't just popular, she was magnetic. Growing up in Amarillo, Angela enjoyed the privileges of a stable, middle-class upbringing, but she was never content to coast. She was ambitious, driven, and deeply social. She loved horses, music, and the thrill of new experiences. Even as a teenager, she had a presence that drew people in, a mix of confidence and warmth that made her equally at ease in a crowded party or a quiet one-on-one conversation. Her friends remember her as a triple threat: beautiful, intelligent, and kind. She had a sharp mind and a quick wit, but she also carried herself with a generosity of spirit that made her stand out. In 1982, Angela enrolled at Southern Methodist University, SMU, in Dallas, Texas. She chose a challenging double major in computer science and electrical engineering. A bold move for a woman in the early 1980s, when STEM fields were still overwhelmingly male-dominated. This choice spoke volumes about her determination and intellect. That same year, she joined the Zeta Tau Alpha sorority, where she quickly became known for her outgoing nature and ability to connect with people from all walks of life. She wasn't the type to fade into the background. She thrived in the social and academic life of SMU. It was during her freshman year that she met Sheila Wysocki, the woman who would become her closest friend and, decades later, the driving force behind solving her murder. The two were paired as roommates in the dorms and bonded almost instantly. They shared late-night talks, inside jokes, and a mutual sense of adventure. After their freshman year, Angela's parents bought her an off-campus condo. She invited Sheila to move in, and together they built a home that reflected their personalities: tidy, welcoming, and full of life. Dallas in the mid-1980s was a city on the rise, a mix of oil boom wealth, southern charm, and a vibrant nightlife. Angela embraced it all. She was a regular at popular clubs, loved meeting new people, and seemed to know everyone everywhere she went. Friends recalled that she could walk into a crowded room and, within minutes, be deep in conversation with strangers who felt like they'd known her for years. Around this time, Angela began dating Ben McCall, a construction crew manager. Their schedules were often at odds. Ben worked early mornings, while Angela's life revolved around classes, studying, and late-night social events, but they made the relationship work as best as they could. Through SMU events, Angela also became acquainted with Russell Buchanan and Anita Kadala, 2 people who would be with her on the last night of her life. While not as close as she was with Sheila, they were part of her wider social circle. Angela's friends often remarked on her fearlessness. She wasn't reckless, but she was open, willing to talk to anyone, to try new things, to live fully. She had a natural empathy that made people trust her quickly. In her sorority, she was the one who would check in on someone having a bad day, or rally a group for a spontaneous night out. She was also deeply committed to her studies. Electrical engineering and computer science were demanding fields, but Angela approached them with the same energy she brought to her social life. She was determined to succeed, to carve out a future that was entirely her own. And this was cruelly snatched away from her. In the early hours of October 13th, 1984, Dallas was winding down from a Friday night. Angela had spent the evening with friends, Russell Buchanan and Anita Kadala, first at the State Fair of Texas, then at the Rio Room, a fashionable dance club where she seemed to know everyone. Witnesses later recalled her moving from table to table, laughing, catching up. Her energy was magnetic. Just after midnight, the trio left. Angela drove Russell home first, dropping him at his apartment on Matilda Street around 1 a.m., only a short walk from her own condo. Then she took Anita home before making a brief stop at her boyfriend Ben McCall's place to say goodnight. At approximately 1:45 a.m., Ben's phone rang. On the other end was Angela, but her tone was off. She told him there was a man in her condo who had asked to use the phone and the bathroom. It's never been clear whether he was already inside when she arrived or if she'd let him in. "Talk to me," she repeatedly said, before promising to call him right back. Then the line went dead. Ben tried calling back. There was no answer, and alarmed, he drove straight to her condo. Her car was outside, the lights were on, but the door was locked, and there was no response when he knocked. Using his work-issued mobile phone, rare in 1984, he called the police. Officers arrived just after 2:15 a.m., forced entry, and found Angela's naked body on her bed. She had been raped and stabbed 18 times, with several wounds piercing her heart. The scene was both brutal and puzzling. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting she may have known her attacker or willingly let him in. Detectives immediately began canvassing the area, interviewing neighbors, and collecting physical evidence, including semen samples, blood, and fingerprints. In 1984, DNA profiling was not yet available, so the biological evidence could only be typed by blood group, which was of limited use. In 1984, homicide investigations leaned heavily on witness statements, alibis, and physical clues that could be matched without DNA. The first step was to look at those closest to Angela. Ben McCall, the boyfriend who had received her final call, his account of events was consistent, and his timeline was supported by phone records. He was cooperative, provided statements, and access to his home. Russell Buchanan, the male friend she had been out with earlier that night, he lived just minutes from Angela's condo. Police questioned him extensively and administered a polygraph, which he passed. An ex-boyfriend was also interviewed, but no evidence tied him to the crime. Despite thorough questioning, none of these men could be linked to the murder through the forensic methods available at the time. The lack of forced entry and intimate nature of the attack suggested Angela knew her killer, but without a clear suspect, the case began to stall. The Dallas Police Department collected semen samples, blood evidence, and other trace materials from the scene. These were preserved in evidence storage, but the technology to match them to a specific individual simply didn't exist at the time. Blood typing could narrow a suspect pool, but not identify a single perpetrator. Fingerprints lifted from the scene were run through available databases, but no match was found. The case file grew thicker with reports, but thinner on leads. Weeks turned into months. Detectives followed up on tips, re-interviewed witnesses, and checked for similar crimes in the Dallas area. Nothing broke the case. By the late 1980s, Angela's murder had joined the ranks of unsolved homicides, a cold case in police terminology. For Angela's friends, especially Sheila Wysocki, the lack of progress was unbearable. Sheila had been Angela's freshman roommate and closest confidant. She quietly vowed to one day find out who had done this. In the early 2000s, Sheila, now a mother living in Tennessee, began contacting the Dallas Police Department about Angela's case. At first, her calls were met with police deflection. Cold cases, especially decades old, often languished without new evidence or leads. But Sheila was persistent. She called repeatedly, asking about the status of evidence and whether it could be tested with modern DNA technology. She wrote countless letters, pressed for meetings, and eventually her determination caught the attention of cold case detectives willing to take on another look. By 2006, DNA profiling had become a standard and powerful investigative tool. The preserved biological evidence from Angela's case, remarkably still intact, was sent for testing. The results were definitive. The DNA belonged to Donald Andrew Bess Jr. Donald Andrew Bess Jr. was born on September 1, 1948, in Jefferson County, Arkansas, and spent his formative years in a working-class environment that, on the surface, appeared unremarkable. Little is publicly documented about his childhood, but by the time he reached adulthood, patterns of aggression and disregard for the law had already begun to emerge. He was a large, physically imposing man, over 6 feet tall and, in later years, weighing more than 300 pounds, and he would use that size to intimidate and overpower others. His early adult life was marked by instability, drifting between jobs and locations, and a growing criminal record that hinted at a dangerous trajectory. By the late 1970s, Bess was living in Texas, and his criminal behavior had escalated from minor infractions to violent sexual crimes. In 1978, he was convicted in Harris County of aggravated sexual assault and aggravated kidnapping. The details of those cases revealed a disturbing modus operandi, targeting women, isolating them, and using both physical force and threats to control them. These were not impulsive acts. They showed planning, predation, and a willingness to inflict severe trauma. The court sentenced him to life in prison, a reflection of the seriousness of his offences and the dangers he posed to the public. Yet, despite the severity of his crimes, the Texas parole system allowed for his early release. In March 1984, after serving only a fraction of his life sentence, Bess was granted parole. This decision placed a convicted, violent sexual offender back into the community, unsupervised beyond the standard parole conditions. At the time, parole boards often weighed factors like institutional behavior and overcrowding pressures. But critics would later point to Bess's release as a catastrophic failure, one that directly enabled him to reoffend. In the months following his release, Bess lived in the Dallas area. He blended into the background of the city's working-class neighborhoods, taking on labor jobs and avoiding the kind of tension that might alert authorities. But beneath that surface, his predatory tendencies had not diminished. His prior convictions showed a man who sought control over his victims, who was willing to use extreme violence, and who had no apparent remorse for the harm he caused. Those who encountered him casually might have seen only a large, quiet man. Those who crossed his path in the wrong circumstances experienced something far more dangerous. This period, between his parole in March 1984 and the murder of Angela Samota in October of that year, is a chilling gap in the public record. There are no known arrests or charges in those 7 months, but given his history, it is possible he engaged in other unreported or unlinked offences, in my opinion. What is certain is that he was living freely, with the opportunity and capacity to reoffend. His earlier crimes had already demonstrated that he was not a man who stopped on his own. Intervention was the only thing that could have prevented further violence. By the time he encountered Angela, Bess was a seasoned offender. He had learned how to approach victims, how to assert control quickly, and how to leave them powerless. His size, strength, and prior experience in committing sexual assaults meant that he could act with confidence, even in situations where there was a risk of being caught. The fact that he was on parole for life sentence crimes underscores the systematic failures that allowed him to be in that position at all. Once the cold case team had the DNA match linking Donald Andrew Bess Jr. to the murder of Angela Samota, the prosecution knew that the science alone, while powerful, would not be enough. They needed to weave the forensic evidence into a compelling, airtight narrative that a jury could follow and believe beyond reasonable doubt. The DNA profile was the linchpin, a match so statistically rare that it effectively ruled out any other suspect. but the state also understood that the defense would attack it at every angle. To fortify their case, they called in forensic experts who could walk the jury through the entire process, from the moment the biological evidence was collected in 1984 to the day it was tested more than 2 decades later. These experts explained the concept of chain of custody in meticulous detail, showing how each transfer, seal, and storage decision was documented and preserved. They described the reliability of modern DNA testing, the safeguards against contamination, and why the results in this case were scientifically unassailable. Alongside the science, prosecutors built a vivid picture of Angela herself, a process known in the legal circles as victimology. They reconstructed her life, her routines, and her relationships, drawing on testimony from friends, family, and the people who saw her on the night she died. Jurors heard about her studies at the Southern Methodist University, her active social life, and the events of October 12, 1984, from the State Fair to the Rio Room nightclub to the final phone call to her boyfriend. This wasn't just to humanize Angela, it was to establish a timeline, to show how she moved through familiar spaces and trusted company before encountering her killer. Every detail helped narrow the window of opportunity and underscored the improbability of anyone other than Bess committing the crime. The prosecution also made strategic use of Bess's criminal history. Under Texas law, prior convictions for similar offenses can be introduced in certain circumstances, particularly when they establish a pattern of behavior. Jurors learned that Bess was not an ordinary man with a single lapse in judgment, but a convicted rapist and kidnapper whose previous crimes bore disturbing similarities to Angela's murder. Survivors of his earlier attacks testified about how he had overpowered them, the threats he made, and the violence he inflicted. This testimony was not only emotionally powerful, but also legally significant, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that Angela's murder fit a long-standing pattern of predatory behavior. As expected, the defense zeroed in on the chain of custody, suggesting that evidence stored for more than 2 decades could have been mishandled or contaminated. They questioned whether every person who had access to the samples had been properly documented, and whether environmental factors could have degraded the DNA. But the prosecution's preparation paid off. The evidence locks were complete, the storage conditions had been controlled, and the forensic experts were unwavering in their testimony. There was no credible alternative explanation for how Bess's DNA came to be inside Angela's body. By the time the state rested its case, the narrative was clear and cohesive. Angela's final hours had been reconstructed with precision. The forensic evidence was scientifically irrefutable, and the defendant's history showed he was both capable of and inclined towards such violence. The combination of hard science, careful storytelling, and corroborated testimony left the defense with little room to maneuver, setting the stage for a swift and decisive verdict. After hearing a week of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a guilty verdict for capital murder. In the sentencing phase, the state emphasized the brutality of Angela's killing, Bess's violent criminal history, and the fact he had committed the murder while on parole. The jury sentenced him to death. For Sheila, sitting in the gallery, it was the moment she had fought for since 1984. The promise she had made to her friend finally fulfilled. Bess remained on death row until his death in 2022, never admitting guilt, but forever marked in the record as the man responsible for ending Angela Samota's life. This case is about Angela, a vibrant 20-year-old with a quick laugh, boundless energy, and plans for a future she would never see. And the unbreakable determination of her friend, Sheila, who refused to let Angela's memory fade into the cold case files. For over 2 decades, Sheila carried the weight of unanswered questions, pushing for action, calling investigators, and keeping Angela's story alive until the truth was finally brought out into the light. In the end, justice came not only through science, but through love, persistence, and the belief that Angela mattered. Bess was convicted, and Angela's killer was named for the world to see. Yet the verdict was never the true closure. That came from knowing her life was honored, her story told, and her friendship with Sheila etched into history as a testament to loyalty in the face of loss. Angela Samota will always be remembered, not as a name in a courtroom, but as a friend, a daughter, a young woman who deserved to grow old, and whose light continues to reach far beyond that October night in 1984. Thank you for listening.